expert in those areas. What I'm talking about should be concerned about the possible implications of these questions in shaping your culture analysis. Cultural diversity then is inevitably connected with tradition. And we cannot assume, this of course is a big if, we cannot assume that traditions disappear or continue to be undermined because the homogenizing process of globalization defined in economic terms. Traditions continue, but traditions always change, but change slowly. For many years, people just assume that traditions are relegated to the background. Passing the traditional society is a distinctive feature of the rise of modernity. And yet, and of course, that is the assumption that traditions always considered as detrimental to the modernizing process. So the more you can undermine the persuasive power or the enduring power of traditions, the more you'll be able to move ahead with this globalization as modernization. Many people are universalists on this campus. And universalists are deeply worried about racial tension, about religion, about linguistic tension and conflict, about too much emphasis on the age cohorts, too much emphasis on place of birth, and so forth. There's also the assumption all these things may turn out to be not very consequential. Often we consider all these things absolutely important for formulating our own cultural identities. But cultural identity, again, is not a very stable category. People think you have a choice. You know, one great contribution of the modernizing process, now we call it globalizing process, is to provide increasingly choices for the human community as a whole. Of course, some societies, less developed societies, may not have much choice. They have to deal with questions of survival. Even there, they all have cell phones. You have all kinds of other gadgets for communication, and you have a lot of choices. Choices of friends, choices of different kind of food, and choices of place to stay, and so forth. Let's assume that probably 1 billion people probably do not even have telephones, so their choices are very limited. And yet, virtually all of them are exposed to various other forms of life. So even in terms of imagining, and many of them, of course, become immigrants. The migration is a major concern in the world. You know how many people migrate in China on a regular basis from the rural area to the urban centers? The estimate now is well over 150 million, which means approaching 20 million, 200 million. That's unthinkable, and yet the society is still relatively stable, maybe underneath all kinds of currents of thought. And yet, one of the assumptions, I'm not going to defend it, I'm just going to state it, is the continuous presence of traditions in modernity. No matter how you define modernity, traditions continue to function. I would either add both as inhibitory factors, undermine the progress of modernization. At the same time, traditions can serve as a shaping influence, whether you like it or not, of the particular form of modernity that is being developed. Without the revolutionary tradition, since the French Revolution, difficult to understand France today, without the tradition of gradualism, inattention to religion, and the continuous concern about rituals that have lasted for centuries, it's difficult for you to understand England. And civil societies are particularly vibrant. I think there's only one country in the world that the civil society is so vibrant. That's the United States. That's not true in France or Germany or Italy, because in France, a very large percentage of the workforce actually is connected with the government employees, which is difficult for them to function as full-fledged members of the civil society. So there are many different styles of expressing modernity, and because of the power of the tradition. In this sense, I make another assumption. It's very consequential. If you accept that assumption, the assumption is that modernity, or the modernizing process, or now we call it globalizing process, can assume different cultural forms. It's difficult to imagine only one cultural form that is rooted in modernity. Of course, there's an assumption, especially based upon cultural diversity, even convergence. Even there's a great diversity. Many of these different cultural traditions converge, and when they converge, homogenization occurs. And if you accept the view that modernity can assume, or the modernizing process can assume different cultural forms, then the question is more complicated. The question is, can we imagine more than one form of modernity? Yeah.
So what I'm taking from this is that, based upon our earlier discussions, Confucianism is almost uniquely positioned to accept this type of globalization and diversity, because isn't one of the major tenets of Confucianism that we, as a flowing stream, can learn from one another? So it's kind of like, it doesn't predicate, unlike other traditions that are saying, this is the only way to go. Confucianism kind of almost encompasses the diversity, or is that wrong?
Whether that's implicit or not, let's leave that question for a while. And I began with the observation, this is a Confucian analysis. And of course, it's based upon some of my biases. And yet, when I say my analysis, you know the distinction between personal and private. It's not simply a private idea. It is personal, and yet I'm willing to debate it. And I think it's discussable, and it can be publicly accountable, and of course, it can also be falsified. And if you assume there are many different cultural, the possibility of different cultural forms in the modernizing process, then the question, difficult question of multiple modernities, at least you have to entertain the possibility. Now, Peter Berger, in a way, accepts it. You also read, hopefully, you also read his piece, using the term many globalizations. If there are many globalizations, of course, there are several, multiple modernities. If you do this, one consequence is in your thinking with view to the future, let's say 21st century, you need to transcend this, I would consider, simple-minded analysis of the global situation in terms of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You first will have to become aware that the sustainability of one superpower not for the next 50 years, but for the next 10 years, is very difficult. Difficult for one superpower to be able to dictate the rules of the game in international interactions. And of course, we know two is no longer relevant, communism and capitalism. And so the former Soviet Union collapsed. So the world is not at all divided into two superpowers. And for why